The Trump administration is set to escalate its trade battles even as the effects are beginning to be felt by Americans. The administration is expected tomorrow to impose $34 billion worth of additional tariffs on Chinese goods. Beijing has vowed to take equal and immediate retaliatory measures. And there is already evidence China is taking measures against American companies. Several U.S. companies say China has drastically increased random port and border inspections over the last month, even ordering perishable goods into quarantine and back to the U.S., in addition to stalling product approvals and slowing up worker visa and licensing applications. And the New York Times reports that there is growing fear stateside that Trump's proposals and trade strategies are hurting the very industries he has vowed to help. Among them, quote, Mr. Trump's recent threats to impose tariffs on imports of European autos could trigger a trade war, raising prices for all vehicles. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Tom Cole of Oklahoma. Thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Thank you.
Congressman, a belated happy 4th. Hope you had a
Thank you very much, Joe.
Good 4th of July.
I did.
Tell us if you agree with the president that winning trade wars is easy.
No, I don't think it's easy, and I start from the perspective of a classic free trader. But I do think the president's trying to reset the table, and in some areas that's actually necessary to do.
What areas do you think the tariffs are necessary?
I think the Chinese, well, I'll give you an example. Actually, my district's one of the leading producers of tires in the world. And a number of years ago, the Chinese were dumping steel radial tires. We went to the WTO and actually set retaliatory tariffs at 35%, lowering to 25, eventually 10, until they changed their practices, and they did. I think that's widely known, frankly, how ruthless they are in terms of the theft of intellectual property. And frankly, again, the size of the trade deficit that we have with China is really not sustainable in the long term. Privately, they'll tell you that themselves. So, again, I don't think they're a particularly good actor on the world scene when it comes to trade. I think a lot of countries around the world would tell you the same thing.
You're talking about taking a case to the WTO and prevailing and getting retaliatory tariffs on the Chinese. The president, of course, telling people in his White House he wants the United States to leave the WTO. Would that be a mistake?
I think so. I think the WTO provides some stability. Frankly, I think I'd like to see it act a little more quickly, and I'm not sure it's quite as fair as it always ought to be, but it still beats a sort of dog-eat-dog international trading system, in my view.
What about China? I think if you talk to most business people, they will tell you that over the past couple of decades that China has not been a good actor on the world stage economically, especially in the theft of our intellectual property. What about though the president's attacks on Canada, the president's attacks on Mexico, the attacks on Germany, the attacks on our allies in the EU? Would you draw a line there and suggest that he not attack?
I would, and I think there, again, for instance, NAFTA's 20-plus years old. It's time to sit down and renegotiate. There's certainly some barriers that I'm concerned about, but we run a trade surplus with Canada, not a deficit overall. And frankly, again, these are friends and allies. I think you treat them a little bit differently. But again, I think just because somebody's your friend and ally politically and militarily doesn't mean they don't try to take advantages economically. And again, that's just part of the way the world works. So I don't mind having direct talks. But again, I see a big difference between the Europeans, the Mexicans, the Canadians, than I do the Chinese.
Bob Cost with the Washington Post is with us and has a question. Bob?
Good to see you, Congressman. Congressman, you come from the wonderful state of Oklahoma. So does EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. Is it time for him to resign?
You know, that's a decision for he and the president to make with one another, but I'm certainly concerned with these sort of mounting missteps. I don't see that they've impacted the way the agency works, but they've certainly raised a lot of questions, and in this business, you can't afford that.
What specifically has raised questions to you?
Oh, I just think the personal activities of looking like you're, bending the rules to favor yourself personally, those things are troublesome. I think using staff for things that are clearly personal, soliciting positions for a spouse, those sorts of things seem to me beyond the pale. They're things that, again, your opponents are going to take advantage of, and they're things that are unseemly.
Want to ask you about the president's separation policy that he backed off on, but it left 2,000 some children in sort of in the balance, not knowing their fate and not knowing if they'll be reunited with their families. And there's a lot of questions about exactly what the status of those children are. A little bit of a problem being able to see them and understand the process. The press seems to be blocked out from that. What do you think of the policy first, and then how it has been handled, understanding that the issue of immigration is deeply complicated and there are other bills that could be put forward that could be constructive, but this policy specifically, what's your take on it?
I think it's unsustainable, unjustifiable. You just simply don't separate families. I think the president beat a hasty retreat on that because the reaction to it was so negative in a bipartisan sense across the board. And I think he was right to do that. I think we ought to be bending every effort to try and put these families back together. It is complicated. The courts have made it extremely difficult to actually hold somebody who has a child. And then, frankly, when you release them, we've had problems with catch and release, people not coming back. But we're just going to have to work through that. At the end of the day, the country's never going to allow a policy like that to stand, nor should it, in my view. But again, as you pointed out, I've dealt with this, frankly, because the subcommittee that I chair funds Health and Human Services. I dealt with it during the Obama years. We're dealing with it now. It's a really vexing problem. The Obama administration itself went to court, lost some court cases on this sort of thing in terms of trying to deal with the families that come, because, frankly, in some cases, the families are using the children as an excuse to get here. You could have gone to any embassy in the country of origin and sought asylum. You can do it at the port of entry without dividing your family. And when you cross the border, you start complicating the situation. You present the border patrol with an almost impossible situation to deal with.
David Ignatius.
Congressman, I wanted to ask you, talking again about trade, whether there are voices in the Republican Party, voices in Congress who are beginning to say to the White House, don't push this much farther. Is there any kind of pushback from Republicans saying, we still need to be the party of trade, don't overdo this?
I think there's been quite a bit of pushback. I think sometimes it gets lost. Almost immediately when the steel and aluminum tariffs were announced, Kevin Brady, who's chairman of Ways and Means, where trade policy centered in the House, put together a letter of over 100 Republican House members, I was one of them, that raised concerns about this and pushed back pretty hard. I think that's continuing. Obviously, we've seen Senator Corker's efforts in the United States Senate. And this is one where, look, the Republican Party's historically been a free trade party, at least since the Second World War, and I don't think that identity is going away. Now, the president's trying to reset the table. We've got some bad actors out there like the Chinese, and frankly, we have some friends that have taken advantage of us because we've been a little bit lax in this area. So we understand what he's trying to do, but we don't want to get in a trade war. We think it's ultimately damaging, and we think it would ultimately undo a lot of the good work the president's responsible for in terms of the tax cut and the deregulatory reform.
You know, there are, all of us have certain things, I think, as Americans we think about on the 4th of July. What makes this country so special to us? I'm curious, what do you think when it's the 4th of July and you have a moment to reflect on your country?
It's funny you should say that. I actually keep a journal, and I was writing in the journal yesterday. Look, I think I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet. You win the human lottery when you're born an American. I've been privileged and blessed to grow up in freedom. Other people have paid a heck of a price for that. My dad was career military, my grandfather, my brother was Vietnam era. I appreciate their service, but when you're in the United States of America, you have really been blessed by the Almighty, and you're in the freest, most diverse, most dynamic country in the world. We've been the leader for 242 years. God willing, we will be for the next 242 years. So I just don't see how you can not feel blessed and fortunate if you're an American.
Congressman Tom Cole, thank you so much for being on this morning. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for waking up after I'm sure, a full day of parades. And people don't understand when they see Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, that's like Pensacola, Florida. That's Central Time Zone, baby.
Thank you.
You got up a little early.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.